She resembled something close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin's, devoid of eyebrows and smeared in makeup. There was a kitten clamped in her jaws so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting out over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and collapsed. From the moment she stepped through the entrance to when she was taken to a hospital room and cleaned up before being prepped for sedation, she was completely calm, expressionless, and motionless. The doctors thought it best to restrain her until the authorities could arrive, and she did not protest. They were unable to get any kind of response from her, and most staff members felt too uncomfortable to look directly at her for more than a few seconds. But the second the staff tried to sedate her, she fought back with extreme force. 2 members of staff had to hold her down as her body rose up on the bed with that same blank expression. She turned her emotionless eyes towards the male doctor and did something unusual. She smiled. As she did, the female doctor screamed and let go out of shock. In the woman's mouth were not human teeth, but long, sharp spikes, too long for her mouth to fully close without causing any damage. The male doctor stared back at her for a moment before asking, "What in the hell are you?" She cracked her neck down to her shoulder to observe him, still smiling. There was a long pause. The security had been alerted and could be heard coming down the hallway. As she heard them approach, she darted forward, sinking her teeth into the front of his throat, ripping at his jugular and letting him fall to the floor, gasping for air as he choked on his own blood. She stood up and leaned over him, her face coming dangerously close to his as the light faded from his eyes. She leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I am God." The doctor's eyes filled with fear as he watched her calmly walk away to greet the security men. His last ever sight would be watching her feast on them one by one. The female doctor who survived the incident named her the Expressionless. There was never a sighting of her again. Hide and seek. In a quiet Italian village, a boy was wandering through the forest. He was walking along with the tall trees that were half bare from their leaves falling. Leaves of orange, brown, and red crunched under his feet as he walked. After walking a while, he grew tired and sat down to rest a bit under a tall oak tree. His eyes began to grow heavy and close, and he thought he heard someone whispering faintly. He drearily opened his eyes and yawned. He still felt tired and a little lightheaded. He wondered how long he had been sleeping. He looked up at the sky. It was gray with clouds, and he thought a storm might be approaching. Suddenly, he heard the crunch of leaves behind him. He peeked his head around the tree to see a little boy about his age standing there. He was wearing a button-up shirt and suspenders. His hair was raven and straggly. The strange boy turned his head around to reveal deep red eyes and a pale face bearing a toothy smile. The boy under the tree stood up. Hi. I'm Isaac," he said, stepping closer to the pale boy. "Why are you out here?" Isaac asked. The pale boy looked at him strangely, as if reading him, and then replied in a light voice, "I'm Adler. Nice to meet you." He held his hand out. Isaac shakes the boy's hand. He has a strong grip. "Do you want to play a game with me?" Adler asks. "Well, it's getting dark, so I can't right now. Maybe tomorrow. Do you live around here?" Isaac replied, rubbing the back of his head. He didn't have much friends and was glad to have a chance to play with someone, but he couldn't right now. should go," Adler said, his voice happy and gentle but commanding at the same time. Isaac stared curiously at the pale boy, stepping back a little. "Okay, see you tomorrow then." Isaac started for the direction of home. He looked back at the boy, but the spot he was standing in was empty. He was slightly unnerved by this, and all the way home he felt as though eyes were upon him somewhere hidden in the brush. He made his way home, ate dinner, and went to bed. He snuggled up in his comforters and laid his head down. He thought he had drifted asleep, but soon enough found himself tossing and turning in his bed, trying to find the most comfortable position. As he lay awake, he thought he heard a slight raking noise against the outside of the house. He brushed it off as nothing until he heard something like nails running along the window. He sunk into his covers. He was on edge and grew frantic when he heard the floorboards just outside his bedroom creak, like a fair amount of pressure was on them. He threw the covers over his head as he heard the steady beat of shoes coming toward him. Isaac's heart raced what seemed 1,000 miles per second. He shut his eyes tight and bit his lip. He felt pressure on his bed, and the springs groaned like someone sitting on the edge. Isaac was dripping with sweat and absolutely terrified as he felt fingers run down the sheets that hid him. He prepared himself for the worst. He shook like a feather in the wind and tried to muffle his frightened whimpering. Suddenly the pressure was gone with another moan of the bed springs, and it seemed the phantom presence was gone. He dared not to look outside of his protective cocoon. He heard scurrying across the floor and strange, unidentified whispers that echoed in his head. Isaac was frozen with fear as a lone finger roamed under the covers and stroked his hand. He relieved himself in his pants. Then after a while, a cold hand holding his, it drew back, and the creaking boards signaled the retreat of whatever entity was tormenting Isaac. Isaac dared now to peek his head out to make sure. The room was still. Not a sound could be heard. He laid down, sheets still drawn up over him, and wanted to go to sleep or have morning come, but he just laid there still paralyzed with fear. After what seemed like an eternity, Isaac felt a frigid gust blow over him, and out of the blue a stiff hand seized his wrist, pulling him down onto the ground. Isaac began shrieking and writhing, trying to break free, but ultimately he was dragged under the bed. He woke abruptly in a river of sweat, gasping for breath, wanting to scream but unable to. As he calmed down, he realized it was only a dream and that it couldn't hurt him. The dawning sun shone brightly through the window, and he took comfort in that. He looked around the room and under the bed. Nothing. He felt a warm wetness around his crotch area. He looked down to discover he had urinated himself. Damn, he thought to himself, that dream really scared me. He got up and walked over to the closet for a change of clothes, when just before he grabbed the door handle, he heard a rasping noise coming from within his closet. He stopped dead in his tracks and hesitantly reached for the handle. He swung it open and flinched, expecting a horrible terror, but only found his calico cat. "Oliver, you startled me," he said, picking up the cat. In the afternoon, Isaac remembered his promise to the more than suspicious character of Adler and made his way into the woods. He came upon the same grand oak tree and looked around. "Adler," he called, his voice echoing through the thick forest. He waited a few seconds before catching a dark figure out of the corner of his eye swoop down out of the trees. With a snap of twigs and crunch of leaves, Adler comes into view as Isaac turns his head. The boy smiles, baring sharp teeth. "You kept your promise," Adler said happily. "Yep," Isaac replied with a nod. "So what should we do?" "Let's play hide and seek," Adler said, jumping with joy. "Okay, these woods are a good spot," Isaac said, letting a smile creep upon him. "All right, you hide now," the pale boy exclaimed, shooing him away. and saw a large German Shepherd-looking dog sniffing around a tree. It was as if it was searching for something, someone. Isaac thought it was a hunting dog and backed into a tree hollow just to be safe. The sniffing grew closer, and Isaac could see the massive paws come so close he could touch them. The dog tilted its head up and inhaled the air, searching for a scent, and then gradually went further and further away. Isaac yet again was waiting, finding it odd that he had not seen any sign of Adler yet. The sky became gray and cloudy soon, and rumbles of thunder could be heard in the distance. Isaac had had enough games and left his hiding spot to search for Adler. He quickly became lost, swearing he had passed the same tree over and over again, and thought it was still in the afternoon. The stormy skies made it appear like the brink of twilight. After what felt like hours of wandering the forest and calling Adler's name, Isaac plopped down under an oak as if to say, "I give up." He leaned his head back against the bark, and then he heard whispering. He couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to resonate around him, making everything feel so peaceful, so dreamlike, so tiring. His eyes became as heavy as bricks, and his entire being pleaded with him to sleep, to rest, at least just for a little while. His eyes began to close, the whispering still soothing his ears until a clap of thunder stirred him. He stood up abruptly, wondering what had come over him. The whispering had stopped, but just then he heard the gliding of wings above him. He turned his head upward, looking for the owner of the wings, but only saw branches, dull leaves, and just maybe a dark figure out the corner of his eye. Isaac began to back away from the tree when he bumped into something. He jumped, turning around to see Adler hanging upside down off a branch. "Found you," he exclaimed with a toothy smile. "Adler, you scared me. Don't mess around like that," Isaac said. Adler looked at him curiously, then placed his arms around his neck and pulled him closer to him so their faces were only an inch away. Isaac was extremely uncomfortable. "Adler, what?" He didn't have time to finish. Adler drew him in so their lips pressed together for a short period of time. Isaac drew back, his face red and warm. "Adler, what the hell?" He started, but noticed Adler's lips. They were covered with blood. Isaac felt something trickle down his chin. He touched his finger to it, and when he took it away, it was stained with the red liquid. Isaac felt his heart leap into his throat, and it had a metallic taste. Blood was seeping through the corners of his mouth. He started to panic. He looked up, but Adler wasn't hanging from the branch anymore. He was gone. Isaac was surprised and slightly frightened. "Adler," he called out, stepping forward. He heard the rustling of leaves and turned his head in the direction of the sound, but found nothing. He heard another noise behind him, turning his head again until he saw nothing. The branches of the trees around him began to sway, then he felt no breeze. Isaac searched frantically around himself, turning his head in a different direction every second. He knew something was around, watching him, toying with him. Isaac hardly noticed as the sounds around him grew faint and his vision blurred. He stumbled forward through the forest, getting lost in a hurricane of trees and shrubs. Isaac couldn't think straight. He aimlessly shuffled through tree after tree, all the while a soft melody playing in his head. It echoed through the forest, resonating in his mind. He found himself being lulled into sleep, into weariness. "This is far enough," Isaac said. The hunters didn't want to leave until they made sure Isaac was safe at his house, but Isaac insisted that they need not go to the trouble. So Isaac thanked them for everything, and the hunters went on their way. Isaac walked over to his house and walked on the door, thinking how worried his mother would be. No answer. He knocked again, still no answer. He found it extremely odd and went over and peered through the window. What he saw next was beyond words, and he was way more than just shocked. He saw Adler in his mother's arms and wearing his overcoat and trousers. Isaac stood there flabbergasted. How could his mother mistake the dark-haired, red-eyed, pale-skinned Adler for the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned Isaac? Isaac began banging on the window. His mother seemed to pay no attention, but Adler turned his head and lifted his finger up to his lips to shush him. How could he be doing this? Isaac screamed in his head. How? Isaac began to think this whole event was an unreal dream. He had to be dreaming. He would wake up in the forest, or better yet, in his bed any second now. But when he didn't, he grew furious and pounded harder against the window. After hours of trying, Isaac gave up and slinked into a dark place to sob all night. The next day, a kind young woman who was unable to have children took Isaac in, and the week went by. Isaac went to peer through his old house window to see Adler and his mother, who seemed to grow older and more feeble day by day, until she was bedridden and by Sunday dead. Isaac sobbed in his bed all day. He didn't know how or why, but he knew it was Adler's doing. How could he have been thrust into the cell, he thought. At midnight he was still laying in his bed, eyes bloodshot and unable to cry anymore. He heard a strange pawing at his window. Then, in a dreamlike and trance-like state, Isaac found himself wandering into the dark forest under the light of the moon, a lullaby playing in his head as though a child singing. He was barely aware of what was happening and couldn't control his own body. He wandered deeper until in the shadows he saw Adler standing there, arms outstretched and bearing his usual pointed toothy smile. Isaac felt warm hands wrapping around him in a loving embrace. A merchant in a town not far from Isaac's was walking down the street when he saw an odd boy with dark hair and pale skin. The boy was holding some rope that was tied to the collar of a German shepherd-like dog. "Morning, kid. Handsome dog you got there." The kid looked at him and grinned. "You like him?" he said excitedly. "Yup, fine hound. What's his name?" the man asked. The boy smirked, bent down petting the dog's head, and planted a kiss on its cheek. "Isaac."